here it is. Okay. We begin our second session. The title of that is The Making of the Portsmouth Peace Treaty. And we have two very important and interesting presentations and two commentators who will make their very valuable input into our discussion. The focus is on the peace treaty. This morning we had a very good discussion, I think, about the origins of the war and the war itself, and we did discuss something about the implications of the war. But this afternoon we will focus on the peacemaking itself, and then if we have time we will again revisit the problem of the implications of the peace and the implications of the war and the rapprochement between Russia and Japan, I think, for international relations and US relations and so on after 1905. We have again 2 hours, and the guidelines are that each speaker will have 15 minutes, and after the presentations, the commentators will have 10 minutes each. And then I'll get back to the original speakers for the additional comments, then open up the rest of the hour, the rest of the 2-hour session for general discussion. Rather than reading from the rather extensive biographies that have been prepared by the conference organizers for the participants, I'm just going to read the first line, I think, in a sense, to say who they are and ask each presenter to make a presentation. Igor Lugoinov is a research associate at the Institute of Russian History at St. Petersburg. The rest you can read in this biography. But I did want to add that he is at work on two projects right now. One is to do a book on the history of the Russo-Japanese War. And another project is a translation into English of a book he published recently on the development of Russian parliamentarism with a focus on Duma. So this will give you some idea of who he is and what he's been working on and so on. And the rest is up to him to make his presentation on the basis of his paper on the making of the peace treaty.
Professor Idia, could I just make a couple of reminders for people?
I'm sorry.
For people not to speak too close to the mic and to speak very slowly.
Was I doing that? I'm sorry.
No, just to remind people about that. Yeah.
Maintain some distance from the microphone. Thank you.
Today we're celebrating 100th anniversary of the Portsmouth Conference. It's a great date, but we could also remember another anniversary. 50 years ago, Boris Romanov published his last book, Essays of the Diplomatic History of the Russo-Japanese War. It was an updated version, and this book by Romanov in the last 50 years was the only serious research devoted to the history of the Portsmouth Peace Treaty. In my opinion, Romanov's work was characterized by the following. He viewed the Portsmouth Treaty and the whole history of the Russo-Japanese War from the point of view of the broadest international relations. He looked at the foreign policies of all great European countries of that period, and I think that was a great contribution that Romanov made as a historian, and I would like to follow this tradition, looking at Portsmouth Peace Treaty and the Russo-Japanese War in this context, in the context of broadly understood international relations. I think that it will be impossible to understand the history of this peace treaty, the history of its making, how it was prepared and made here in Portsmouth. My comments may seem paradoxical to some, but I think that Japan, to a much larger extent than Russia, was interested at the very beginning of the war in its soonest end. If you look at how preparations the war were made, you could see that the Japanese government started doing it in 1904, and the main points for the future peace treaty were already formulated at that time. In Russia, serious attention to the end of the war happened half a year after. It was after the fall of Port Arthur, and it was largely determined by the public opinion, not so much by the government. The government considered that it was too early to start making the peace, so that it could be delayed until the spring, and Russian government only seriously started thinking about the conclusion of the peace after Tsushima, when it became clear to the Russian authorities that they wouldn't be able to win this war. I also want to point out the following. The Japanese, both in the war and in diplomatic relations and diplomatic contacts, were unified, had a consistent approach, although there were a variety of opinions between Hayashi and Komura. I would like to point out that in Russia there was no unity of opinions until the very end of the making of the Portsmouth Peace Treaty. And for a long time, up to the beginning of the Portsmouth conference, there was no unified opinion on the Russian part, and it can easily be traced in various documents. If Witte spoke in favor of the end of the war at the very beginning, and he made 3 serious attempts to start negotiations with the Japanese. The rest of the Russian government, the most influential ministers, all had their own opinions. Some of them, military ministers, thought that it was still possible to win the war. The Minister of Finance based their opinion on whether it's possible to win this war from the financial point of view. And very often their opinions were based on their narrow interests. And I think that only at the Portsmouth conference some kind of a consolidation of opinion took place. And this consolidation took place in Russia for the first time in a decade, basically, of the Far Eastern policy. And I think that this consolidation, when the opinions of the major players were collected and unified, and eventually the unified Russian position was formulated. I think that this was very important step. This unified and clear position was a victory for Russia, but not a victory over the Japanese, but a victory over its own messiness and inconsistency of the previous Far Eastern policies that was partly to blame for the start of the Russo-Japanese war. I believe that the Russian delegation was able to get prepared for the Portsmouth Peace Conference very well. Russian Ministry of Foreign Affairs were able to assess the positions and the demands, were able to forecast it in advance, and were able to prepare the Russian position. And I don't belong to supporters of Witte and apologists of Witte, and I don't share the position that was widely spread in the last decade, that Witte was one of the major players, and that he was the one who was to thank largely for the actual peace treaty that was concluded. If you look at the history of preparation conditions, how Witte behaved in Portsmouth, I would like to point out the opposite. For Witte, the Portsmouth Conference and the peace treaty and his participation as the major envoy of Russia was not a selfish goal, but it was an attempt, a means for him to go back to real politics after his retirement from the position of the Ministry of Finance. And I think that because he thought it was the means for him to go back to politics, it affected his behavior to a large extent. In order to reach his own goals, Witte was willing to make much bigger concessions that were dictated to him from St. Petersburg. And I can say that the provisions of the peace treaty were largely determined not by the arguments by Witte, but by the dictations from St. Petersburg, from Tsar Nicholas II. Nicholas did not think that concession of Sakhalin was a loss for the Russian territory. He thought that since Russia obtained the Sakhalin only 30 years before the Portsmouth Conference, could not be considered a territory of Russia. So he believed that he could give up this territory, what was for him a concession of South Sakhalin. It was a gesture, a way to demonstrate that Russia was willing to make peace. And I think that his firm position is to thank, despite the pressure on the part of Germany and on the part of France and on the part of President Roosevelt, who tried to make Nicholas go to bigger concessions. And I think that this position determined the results of the Portsmouth Peace Treaty. I think the treaty itself became possible due to this reason. The minimum of Japanese demands and the maximum of Russian concessions did not contradict each other. Witte, when he was going to Portsmouth, he believed that the peace treaty would never be concluded. You could hardly find a more pessimistic official. He believed that he didn't believe that he would be able to make peace, and everybody remembers how Witte tried to win the American public opinion. Many people think that Witte was going to the United States as a person who was determined to open the American stock market for Russian stocks. It was the struggle for American public opinion that was not directly connected with the Portsmouth Treaty. He didn't believe it would result in success, and Witte was trying to enter the American market, and also he tried to undermine the support of Jewish American bankers of Japan, which was a retaliation for the anti-Semitic policies of Russian government. I don't want to speak about the role of the United States at large. My colleague later will do it. But I want to mention that President Roosevelt's role as a mediator was very important, especially in the organization. And I think that President Roosevelt was very delicate, and he didn't behave very typically. If you consider it was the Paris Peace Conference, the situation here was quite different. Both parties did not believe that they lost this war, including Russia, but no party could claim an unequivocal victory as well, because no army suffered complete defeat, and I talk about the ground forces. So in this situation, it wasn't clear who was the winner and who was the loser, so I think Roosevelt was more subtle here. He did not try to get some benefits, some advantages for the United States. However, the United States did get certain advantages and certain benefits, and I think that it was a certain stage in the development of international relations, and that was the stage when the role of a mediator who is trying to grab some benefits from the winner started to change, and the mediator here takes a different, a more modest position. I think that was demonstrated in full by the peace conference, and I think that the format of the peace conference itself changed, of the conference that is basically the end of the military conflict. I can't agree with many researchers who write about the role of the Roosevelt. If you look at the facts, Roosevelt lost part of his influence over the events, and the position of the parties at the conference itself was determined by the delegations, but largely by instructions from Tokyo and St. Petersburg. And those instructions were given without the direct influence of Roosevelt. So what I'm saying, at the conference itself, Roosevelt did not have as big an influence, and he was not the one who dictated the provisions of the treaty, but they came out of the reality and out of the positions of the parties themselves. What I would like to say in the conclusion is attitude towards peace. Witte, when he was going to Portsmouth, put in front of him an interesting, if somewhat risky task. He didn't see the peace conference as the end of the war. He looked at it as a possibility to make an ally agreement between Russia and Japan, which would be the basis for further resolution of conflicts between these two countries. And this found certain reflection in the position of Witte during the negotiations. What I find interesting is
встретил весьма неоднозначное отношение в России, ведь не случайно Витте получил
over Portsmouth peace, and although coming back, Witte was nicknamed Count Half-Sakhalin. At the same time, Komuro, who signed this peace treaty, caused riots in Japan, in park in Tokyo and a number of other Japanese cities. So the public opinion towards this treaty was very controversial. But if we look at the relations between the two countries after the war, between Russia and Japan, I'd like to point out that neither Russia nor Japan wanted to get back at the other party. Japan didn't want to conquer other parts of Russia or from the Russian sphere of influence, and neither Russia wanted to capture some of the territories. Before Japanese attack, World War II, Stalin declared that his generation waited for 40 years an opportunity to get back the territories that were lost in 1905. But as a matter of fact, I believe that it goes counter to all of the international relations after 1905. And that statement shows that the Soviet government fundamentally changed the paradigm, and instead of international attitude, followed more nationalistic approach. And that's what changed the character and the most characteristics of the Soviet government attitudes after the war and after the victory. That is why I think this treaty was very important in that it was a compromise on both ends, while at the same time it was a diplomatic victory for Russia, and it was a diplomatic victory over its own problems that Russia had in the Far East. It was a successful attempt to come up with a clear political diplomatic line. As far as the direct consequences of the treaty, I think the major consequences were for China because it ensured the Chinese territorial integrity. It was written in the treaty that Manchuria will remain a part of China. And I think it was very important for the balance of power in the Far East. And it also helped to maintain China as a country whose territorial integrity was preserved, just as well as it was done for Turkey previously. As far as Russia is concerned, Portsmouth Treaty, both in its preparation and its conclusion, it was not necessarily a change in the direction of policy from Europe to the Far East, but it was a process of creation of the Triple Entente, of the anti-German coalition in Europe. And that's the role of the Portsmouth Peace Treaty. Russia could not deviate from that path, or it would be very difficult for it to deviate from that path after the treaty was signed. So I think that this treaty had more far-reaching consequences for Russia than just as far as in as much as it influences relations with Japan and with other countries in Asia. With this, I'll conclude the summary of basically my research, but I'll be very happy and will be very grateful for any comments regarding the paper that I presented. Thank you very much.
Very much. There's a lot in the presentation that I think we'd want to come back to discuss. What to some people would appear as a new or revisionist interpretation of Wittes' foreign policy was one of the contributions, I think, of this essay. The view that the Russo-Japanese war and the peace treaty ushered in an era, 40 years of Russian-Japanese compromise or understanding, that was a theme that also was discussed at the conference we held in Tokyo in May. Some of you were there. Conference, and the meaning of that, that is the fact that between Russia and Japan, at least, there was some basic understanding till 1945. What does that mean, that there was that? The implications of that in terms of Asian international relations, US relations with Japan, and Russian-Chinese relations, all of which I think are very interesting questions that if we don't have time to discuss them today, I hope we can come back to those tomorrow. And lastly, I think Koyanov properly mentioned the question of China, because I thought that was missing in this morning's discussion. I mean, after all, talking about a war that was fought on Chinese soil, and I think somehow or other we've got to bring China back into this as a very main part of the story of the war and the peace, I think. But why don't we go to the second presentation by Eugene Trani, whose work on the Portsmouth Peace Conference, I think it's very appropriate to provide a setting for this conference. So he has been president of Virginia Commonwealth University for 15 years, 16 years, something like that. I don't know how anybody can survive as being president of college. Coming from Harvard, I can speak from some experience, I think, not indirect experience. How anybody can survive and also be productive, as Gene has been. Maybe it's by being productive that you survive as college president. But in any event, he says he's going to remain in this presidential post for another 5 years, and at the same time he's going to write a book, and the next book, as indicated here, is going to be on changing American perceptions of Russia and China. So, Gene.
Thank you. Thank you, Professor Uriye. I'm delighted to be here, and I want to commend the organizers of this important symposium. Obviously, we are celebrating the 100th anniversary of the signing of the Treaty of Portsmouth, and certainly everybody in New Hampshire and indeed throughout the United States got good news from the BRAC Commission when they decided to keep the Portsmouth Navy Yard active, which was a very big deal. I am flooded with memories. I have one of my graduate school classmates, Professor Frank McCann from the University of New Hampshire, who has come up with his wife Diane. And 40 years ago, I was doing research on what eventually became the Treaty of Portsmouth, an adventure in American diplomacy. And they actually let me stay at the Wentworth Hotel in the mid-1960s. Now, to be sure, everybody knew I was on a student rate, my wife and I, but that was when it was open, before it was shut. And I gather I haven't been there in years, but it is a grand place now. In the 36 years since this was published in 1969, a whole bunch of new material has come out. New archives, such as the Archive of the Foreign Policy of the Russian Empire, many new additions to the literature, collections of printed documents, new articles, a dozen books. During that same period of time, my interest has also gone in different directions, although it stays in the same general area. I remain very interested in American-Russian relations, and in particular, American perceptions of Russia and how they develop and how important they are. And if I would put a subtitle on this paper, I would say the Treaty of Portsmouth, the beginning of a century of hostility between the United States and Russia, because I really believe that was the first major incident in what became a century of hostility between the United States and Russia. In 2002, Don Davis and I did a book entitled The First Cold War, The Legacy of Woodrow Wilson and U.S.-Soviet Relations, in which the Cold War, the origins of the Cold War, gets moved back to 1920. And we are now working on a book on why Americans love the Chinese, hate the Russians, have done it for 125 years, and what are the implications of that for current foreign policy in the year 2005, which I think are pretty significant. The 1969 book, I devoted a chapter to Roosevelt and the Russians, basing much of it on the American ambassador in St. Petersburg at that time, on George von Lenn-Gerke-Meyer and his papers, which are at the Massachusetts Historical Society. I also followed up with an article on Meyer's view of Russia, because Meyer clearly had enormous influence on the images that Theodore Roosevelt had about the Russian government, about Tsar Nicholas, about affairs in Russia. At that point, it crossed my mind that Americans have had a negative view of Russia and Russians for a very long time. That has been confirmed in the many trips that I've taken to the Soviet Union and Russia, why the Russians asking the question, why do Americans dislike the Russians so much? And in fact, I had the great pleasure in 1981 to be senior Fulbright lecturer at Moscow State University for 4 months, and that was a major topic of discussion. It's got me to think about American-Russian relations in a much broader context than I certainly thought in the 60s. If you take Theodore Roosevelt to President President Reagan, what are the themes that come out, and what is the influence of certain individuals? Don Davis and I recently did a paper that was published in Moscow entitled A Tale of Two Kennans. And I actually believe that the bookend George Kennans, George Kennan the Elder, the author of the Siberia and the Exile System, and George Kennan the diplomat, had enormous influence on American views and American policies towards Russia, the Soviet Union, and now Russia again. And much of that influence is not a positive influence. George Kennan the Elder maintained that Russia was a land of misery, injustice, and tyranny. When Admiral Togo sank the Russian fleet and blockaded Port Arthur, U.S. opinion supported Japan, very interesting. And Kennan orchestrated that opinion. He predicted swift victory for the Japanese and revolution for Russia. As Theodore Roosevelt's confidant, he was in close touch with Japanese leaders and carried President's views directly to the Prime Minister of Japan. In Kennan's war coverage, Japan represented modern civilization. Russia reflected medieval barbarism. Kennan even crusaded among Russian POWs against their czar. Most importantly, he helped shape Theodore Roosevelt's attitude and policy. TR considered him the most influential journalist of the era. He courted Kennan because he valued his opinion and his support. The newspaper's printed page mattered to TR, and Kennan was the premier maker of that page concerning Russia. It is worthwhile to consider what Kennan wrote about Russia, Japan, and the Russo-Japanese War. Kennan pointed out Japanese patriotism and friendly feelings towards Americans. There was almost nothing in Japan to suggest war or the preparation of major campaigns on the Asian mainland. Only in the Japanese press did one find hints. The Russian Bear sinking in a torpedoed battleship, or a Russian Gulliver with Japanese soldiers crawling all over his body. Kennan wrote how carefully the Japanese prearranged the war through advanced preparations. And all of this modernity that we saw last night, Kennan was saying the same thing in widely circulated articles. Russian POWs believed the Japanese fought well and that Russian strength in Manchuria was overestimated. Kennan concluded that Japan treated her enemies better than Russia treated her subjects. And that's what he was saying to Americans, from Theodore Roosevelt to the man and woman on the street. Kennan visited Admiral Togo's fleet. Here was the center of supplying the Third Imperial Army besieging Port Arthur. Supplies, especially those made in Japan, helped reduce Japan's cost of the war. Kennan devoted 16 articles on the war itself, one evaluating the head of the Russian Manchurian army, 12 on the siege of Port Arthur, and 3 on the war at sea, and especially the epical battle between Togo and Rozhestvensky. Kennan claimed that long-range marksmanship as well as accurate intelligence and superior speed accounted for the Japanese astonishing naval victory at Tsushima. On land, the Japanese army, with considerable effort at trench warfare and siege artillery, got a commanding view of the 12-mile semicircle of the Russian forts guarding Port Arthur. With the news of the approach of Russia's Baltic fleet, the emperor ordered the Japanese military immediately to take Port Arthur, whatever the cost. That effort claimed 12,000 lives, and Kennan showed that considerable military stores were still held by the Russian defenders, in contradiction to Russian generals' later statements showing that the Russians were in fact afraid of the Japanese and surrendered far too prematurely. At Port Arthur, as well as in Manchuria, the Russian were portrayed badly by Kennan as being poorly led and outclassed. In Kennan's most cited article, The Sword of Peace in Japan, he recounted the stormy reception in Japan of the terms of the Treaty of Portsmouth. Kennan believed that the Japanese expected and perhaps had a right to expect decisive results. They were, according to Kennan, quote, greatly exacerbated by the attitude of the Russian government towards it before, during, and after the peace conference. Kennan thought that the Japanese cabinet would have been glad, no doubt, if President Roosevelt's intervention had come 2 or 3 months later. Kennan's commentary elicited TR's strong rebuke, but in private. Kennan wrote, "It seems to me that it would have been much better for Russia as well as for Japan if President Roosevelt had waited until the close of this campaign before he suggested a peace conference." When Kennan returned home in June of 1906, he admitted his mistake to the president because he had since learned the truth of Japan's financial exhaustion from Japanese officials. Roosevelt told Kennan how much influence the journalist had exerted on official policies. His articles, Kennan's articles, had led TR to withdraw the American legation from Korea and to give the Japanese a free hand in Korea. This largely untapped source of Kennan's articles constantly contrasts an enlightened Japan with an unenlightened Russia, a semi-barbarous medieval European nation not equal to Japan's modern civilization. TR's awareness of Kennan's importance in shaping his own and America's perception was best indicated in the private rebuke TR gave to Kennan, acknowledged by the latter in 1906. The arc of American negative perceptions and policies towards Russia begins with Kennan's famous book in 1891. It was greatly extended by TR's own attitude, often shaped by Kennan during the war, and became American policy at the Portsmouth Peace Conference. TR was much more sympathetic to the Japanese. To be sure, he was concerned about Japan, and as my colleague just pointed out, Roosevelt was concerned about the preservation of China. but his attitude towards the Russians was negative in the extreme. Consider our analysis in the following way. The U.S. had, by the end of the Russo-Japanese War, come to the conclusion, both as public policy and a widely held American perception, that Russia was, in a latter popular phrase, an evil empire. That was the view that Americans had of Russia at the time of the Russo-Japanese War. This negative perception of Russia, whether czarist or commissarist, was held with only a few exceptions through the last century. These exceptions were clearly Wilson's support of the provisional government in 1917 and FDR's recognition, Lend-Lease, and the wartime alliance from 1933 to 1945. It had been informed by both a popular opinion that Russian governments were devious and dangerous and a public policy of non-recognition, restraint on trade, and a growing apprehension that required a military build-out, which turned into the arms race known as the Cold War. In our forthcoming book, we trace these negative perceptions, and I would emphasize, in terms of Russia, the Kennons were important. The dominance that emigre scholars played in the teaching about Russia and the Soviet Union was also a very significant influence. I did my undergraduate work at the University of Notre Dame, and the course said Russian history. It wasn't Russian history at all. It was 5 centuries of the exploitation of Poland by the Russian Empire and the Soviet Union. Why? Because it was taught by a Polish American who was fighting a war every semester in front of students in South Bend, Indiana. And how much did that occur throughout the whole United States and contribute to the extension of this negative view, which started with Kennan in 1891. So by the time of the second Kennan, the distant cousin of the first, American negativism to Russia had become enshrined. Indeed, it had been Kennanized. Even FDR's heroic efforts to reverse that failed. The significance of what I see of the Treaty of Portsmouth, it is the first step of a decade of hostility between the United States and Russia, and it all fits into place when you look at Theodore Roosevelt's attitudes and, in fact, the Russian reaction to what Theodore Roosevelt did. And we have seen some interesting both postcards and the illustrations that were just shown from the Library of Congress, where Theodore Roosevelt was pushing the Tsar over a cliff and was standing behind the Japanese. Russian postcards were quite clearly Russians' attitude. So I would conclude, at the beginning of the 21st century, America finds itself in a quandary of how to develop a more balanced approach to Russia, and indeed it needs to rethink the attitudes that started way back in 1905. Thank you very much.
Thank you very much. I'm glad that his presentation ended with the 21st century, because it does seem to me that part of our fascination, and I think that fascination has been expressed by the fact that there have been so many conferences on the Russo-Japanese War, which took place 100 years ago. I think that part of the fascination is because we are thinking about the future, even as we look back on the past. And so Jean Trani's presentation in terms of the long history of US-Russian relations, and he has, I think, tried very skillfully, I think, to put the Russo-Japanese War and Theodore Roosevelt and so on in the context of the longer history of US-Russian relations. That's a very plausible approach, I think, one approach to the subject. I hope that before we disperse tomorrow evening or Sunday morning, we'll have come to some understanding about what's happening in today's world, or to have some kind of tools with which to look ahead into the future. We have 2 very important contributors as commentators this afternoon. I'll first turn to Andrew Gordon, who's a colleague of mine, Harvard's History Department, teaching Japanese history, who just began to serve as his second year, I think, chair of the History Department. He has worked primarily in the field of Japanese labor history, but currently his research interests have become broader, and one of which is to study the development of Japanese consumer society with a focus on the sewing industry. I think Andy has been studying the importation of sewing machine by the single sewing company and so on into Japan in pre-war, in the pre-war period. So Andy, please.
Thank you very much, Akira, and thank you to the conveners of this conference and to the writers of two very interesting papers that I'll comment on some, but I'll also leap from there to some more general comments because, as the introduction made clear, I'm not particularly an expert on either the Russo-Japanese War in itself or the negotiations over the peace of the war. I have studied in some detail the domestic turbulence in Japan after the Russo-Japanese War, beginning with the riot in Tokyo in exactly a century ago this week. It lasted for 4 days, so I suppose if today is the 9th, it was the day of the wrapping up of that event, and quite an extraordinary upheaval that had a lot of consequences. But I won't talk about that. It's really not relevant to the papers or to this panel. I will just say that at the time that I did that research, I did run across, because I was interested in American writings on the riot, Kennan's article, Sword of Peace, and I was not in grad school, but just, anyway, it was a long time ago, and I picked it up and I said, well, I knew that George Kennan was pretty old. This was in around 1981. But let's see, he must have been about a 5-year-old prodigy of some sort when he wrote that. And then I did a little tracking down and realized it was not the same man, but indeed a relative. And in that sense, I'm very grateful, though, to Professor Trani's paper that gave a lot more analytic force or interpretive force to the relationship between the two. Let me start with Professor Lukoyanov's paper, which I particularly enjoyed, perhaps part because I know so little about the Russian side of the negotiations. It's a very richly detailed view of the tensions within the Russian side, both between Petersburg and Portsmouth, Nicholas and Witt and others, the military and the Tsar and the negotiators. And what I particularly learned, and I think is so important, is the diciness of the process. The prospects on the Russian side that this could have all fallen apart, this being the treaty negotiations, could have fallen apart, emerge in the detail of this paper as having been very real. And Witt emerges as somebody who calculated very flexibly and yet firmly to get a settlement, taking some risks in the process that was arguably better than the military situation justified, and was even perhaps better than, in a sense, the diplomatic situation justified. And although it's not a heroic portrayal of Witt, it's nonetheless a portrayal of a very careful and skilled negotiator. Professor Trani's paper with Professor Davis examines this fascinating figure of the elder George Kennan, and as he said himself, it's a man who does accept the Japanese view of themselves that John Dower showed us last night as modern, as at the cutting edge of the move into the new 20th century of civilization. And it's almost as if he was looking at the postcards and reaching the same conclusions that we were urged to reach last night. Although I think there is a view, certainly it's a view that Roosevelt had, even if Kennan didn't, of this extremely modern Japan as an uneasy and possibly threatening presence. And this comes through in the paper, in Roosevelt's clear unease at the extremeness of Kennan's very strong tilt towards the Japanese, because although Roosevelt himself was very sympathetic to the Japanese and critical of the Russians, he nonetheless was seeking a kind of containment of both sides, I believe, in his goals, in helping to facilitate the convening of the conference, if not its actual results, which has been said he really did not control. And he ends with the very strong long-run statement, which you heard, it's also in the paper, of a century of troubled and contentious Russian-American relations, and part of that, long part of that Soviet-American relations, having really been generated, if not out of this war itself, in part out of the way American public opinion was shaped in that war by the elder Kennan. So those are the main points of the two papers. I want to offer some general comments on the papers, their characteristic, or one characteristic of them, and then come back to this point of long-run, century-long or 50-year-long legacies, and try to be a little provocative in that. I think both the strength and the weakness of both papers is their deep rooting in one site. They're uni-archival, unilingual, and to that extent, inevitably unidimensional studies, one of the Russian story, one of the American story. At one point in time, that was really the only way that international relations history and diplomatic relations history was done. And it still remains valid. There's much of value in these papers, as I've suggested. But how much more valuable would it be to do multi-archival work rather than to have to rely on secondary work or translated work or third-party views of the other side? And of course, we have in this room the people who can provide the other side, and collaboration then is one way to get around this problem, and conferences like this is a way to get around that problem. But my personal view, which may be a little bit against the grain of human interaction and networks being important, is that there's an extraordinary value in having one person's interpretive approach, not that it's the only right approach, it's never the only right approach. There's a lot of value in having one person's interpretive approach be applied to the whole problem. And in that sense, when I read the papers, I didn't know the ages of the authors. I could guess that a university president was probably older than me, but Professor, although my president is younger than me, and there's Professor Lukoyanov, though, is certainly young enough, and I urge you, learn Japanese. It will only take a couple years. A couple years of 10-hour days, 5 days a week, and you will be able to do, and I'm really not teasing. Professor Irie did this, and others, it's possible to do so. And because of the extraordinary skill you've shown in drawing out the story in that is embedded in the Soviet, in the Russian sources that you draw on, and then that were collected in archives over the decades since then. There's a similar story. Professor Iokibe gave some sense of that this morning that could be drawn out from the Japanese side. And how might it change the picture to do that, to look in their own voices, as you do with the Russian participants, or their own memoranda and letters, not voices, at the interactions between Komura and people back in Tokyo, for instance. It would perhaps just reinforce and enrich the picture, actually, in this case, to show more fully, perhaps not confusion, but also great tension in the Japanese story. I felt this morning that some of the view that the Russians were confused and uncertain and the Japanese were solid had to do with the fact that that was coming to some extent from scholars who were mainly looking at in more detail at the Russian actors. That wasn't, of course, entirely true. We had some Japanese presenters this morning, but there was a lot of tension and diversity within the Japanese within the key Japanese actors as well. So I do want to urge that as people go forward to continue to look at this important event, we try to do it as much as possible in this multi-archival, multilingual mode. But I also want to spend the rest of my time talking about some long-term legacies or legacies is a positive word, and I'm really talking more about burdens that have come out of this treaty settlement or the peace settlement. Certainly, we tell, as historians, we're supposed to look at the past in its own terms, to evaluate the parties and the participants in terms of what was possible at the time, what people thought at the time, what the reigning assumptions were at the time, rather than impose on them the burden of having the hindsight that can only be won with 50 or 100 years experience. And so, in that sense, there are really two ways one ought to assess the legacy or the burden left by the treaty. And then the first would be in that spirit of looking somewhat narrowly in the terms of that time. And to the extent one does this, I believe the conclusion is the peace conference and the treaty was a considerable achievement. And this comes back to what I said before, about the paper, especially by Professor Lukoyanov, that and this morning's statements about considerable confusion and uncertainty, that in that context, it was a very real possibility that however much both people on both sides desired an end to war, they could have blundered their way to a failure. There were moments when both sides were ready or were packing their bags and preparing to leave Portsmouth. If either had walked away, hostilities might have resumed. There would have been, after 200,000 dead already, more death and destruction, and perhaps in the end, a settlement probably not that different than what had been achieved. Measured against the fact that such outcomes were, I think, plausible, if not, probably not likely, but were certainly imaginable, then the negotiators, Roosevelt for bringing people to the table, and then the negotiators for actually negotiating the settlement, do deserve the credit. They perhaps all should have gotten the Nobel Prize rather than just Roosevelt. But at the same time, it's surely important, since we have the advantage of hindsight, to take advantage of it and to step back and ask about the long-term picture. And here I think to be a bit extreme, we can say that if not all, that most of the very important tensions that marked the middle of the 20th century in Asia and World War II and the second half and now, most of these important tensions were either left unresolved by the settlement, or in some cases perhaps even intensified or to some extent created by the settlement. And I want to just spell out, I can see 4 areas where one can make this case. The first has already been made by Professor Trani, so I won't repeat it, but that's a legacy of American-Russian tension. A second that he argues didn't exist to the same extent before this moment, and has been, with some key exceptional periods since then, present. Second, and hardly mentioned at all, so I'd like to really stress it, is a century of difficult relations between Japan and Korea. It's been said that this is a Russo-Japanese war, yet it was fought in China, but it was also fought in and around Korea. The Straits of Tsushima are between Japan and Korea. Japanese troops were moving in Korea. One result of the war was the colonization of Korea by Japan. More so than 1910, I think most historians would agree that this 1905 autumn was the decisive moment, as a result of the way the war ended, for Japan to consolidate a control of Korea as a semi-colony and then as a formal colony 5 years later. And the problematic legacy of that not only continued through World War II, but in many ways is still continues. The second way in which the settlement of the war left a burden to history rather than a sort of positive legacy has to do with Japan-China relations in relation to Manchuria and the Second World War. And the point here isn't that there's a straight line between the end of the Russo-Japanese War and the treaty and the Japanese getting railroad rights in southern Manchuria but a kind of dotted line, which was then turned into a straight line subsequently by later events. So it's not, I'm not making a fully determinist argument, but I still think there's some important connections. One of the graduate students that I'm working with is doing a doctoral dissertation as a biography of a man named Uchida Yasuya, who was the president of the Southern Manchurian Railroad in 1931 at the time of the Manchurian incident, and then became foreign minister, and was a very key figure in Japanese foreign policy establishment in the 1920s and 1930s. He played a critical role in consolidating elite support at home in Japan in 1931, 32, 33 in favor of the Army's independent action in Manchuria that led to the creation of Manchukuo and initiates what some call the 15 Years' War. The point that, and it was a nice coincidence because I didn't know this until about a week ago when I just coincidentally received this chapter and read it. The point that the student's name is Rustin Gates, to give him credit, he argues that Uchida, who was 66 years old at the time he was president of the Southern Manchurian Railroad in 1931, had then been 40 years old in 1905, was a mid-level foreign service diplomat, career diplomat in Japan, and in a sense was present at the creation of Japan's foothold in Manchuria. In 1905, he negotiated as Komura's assistant the Treaty of Peking, which is mentioned briefly in one of the morning papers, that consolidated Chinese recognition of Japan's new place in Manchuria after the Russo-Japanese War. And Uchida wrote in his diary at the time how he wished Komura were alive to advise him, and how he saw himself in the way he was superintending Manchuria policy in those years of the early 1930s as trying to put in place or finish the unfinished business of Komura. So there you have a very powerful legacy and then carries forward. And I was really struck by that observation. So we have Korea-Japan tensions, we have Japan-Manchuria, and then by extension through the war, post-war, Japan-China tensions. The third would be Japan-Russian tensions, and here I realized at lunch that my lunchtime conversation with a few colleagues that my understanding of this was a little off. But nonetheless, the large point, and I won't go into the details since others have a better understanding of them and can address it, the disposition of the territory question, the way it was handled at the end in the treaty, can, I think, be linked to the problems that the Russians and Japanese have had in resolving their territorial issue through and beyond the Second World War to the present. So the point being that in thinking about this treaty, we need to keep in mind, at least in 4 dimensions of American-Russian, Japanese-Korean, Japanese-Chinese, and Japanese-Russian relations, problems that have been not only that the treaty failed to resolve, because it's a heavy burden to place on any treaty to resolve all existing problems, but in some cases were made more difficult perhaps by the treaty. So I'll end my comments there and look forward to your thoughts.
Thank you, Andy. Next and final commentator is Tatiana Filipova, who was also at the conference in May, and as was mentioned this morning, made a wonderful presentation about Russian depictions of Japanese at the turn of the century. She's editor of the editor of historiography for the magazine Rodina, which is a historical monthly. She tells me that she is now editing a special issue of this journal to coincide with the visit to Japan by President Putin, and this special issue is going to be called From Putin to Putin. Thank you.
Thank you for this nice stereo. Thank you. I must say that the most impressive feature of all the papers delivered today, both sections, was their broad historical and cultural context. This broad context helps to come to an interesting conclusion that Russo-Japanese War was the first image war in the history of the 20th century. Of course, every war to some extent is an image war. Even the Crusaders had their own PR project, ideological project. But when I say about Russo-Japanese War as an image war, I mean that both sides consciously elaborated their own technologies to make an influence upon the public opinion home and abroad. It was a very interesting situation when both Japan and Russia found themselves between Asian traditional imperial behavior and new westernized imperialistic behavior. It was a very difficult, a very strange position, and this was the main idea of the image war. The rivalry between two modernizational projects, and the United States played a role of judge of Supreme Court in this rivalry. And in the middle of this problem was the question of identification, new identification of the old empire under modernization. I mean the situation after Meiji Restoration in Japan and after the epoch of great reform of Alexander II. Who is more Europeanized? Who is more barbarian? Those were the questions. And very often these questions stayed open. To my mind, the papers delivered today and my own work on the materials of Russian newspapers, journals, posters devoted to this period helps me to come to the conclusion that the main idea of Russian image war was not racism, was not racist attitude to the Japanese aggressive behavior. It was ageism. It was the attitude to the young empire that is too young to participate in the concert of great powers. Its aggressiveness was childish, and the cruelty was also a cruelty of a child, not of adult person. This feeling strongly influenced Russian attitude even to Portsmouth Treaty. The comparatively young American power took side of also young imperialistic aggressive power Japan. Now I'd like to formulate my question to Professor Trani. From this point of view, what's your attitude to the American public opinion? I do not mean the opinion of President, whoever American president is, but public opinion concerning the impression of this rivalry. Was it a rivalry between old empire and new empire? Was it a rivalry between different imperial projects of westernization, modernization? Or was it a rivalry between different political cultures, different ways of modernization, different strategics? I'd like to depict a very interesting, in this connection, caricature published in Russian magazine Askolki, it means splits. It was published right on the eve of Portsmouth treaty. Just imagine an old Chinese man playing with a paper dragon, paper kite. And there are two words on this paper kite, Asian tradition. And in front of him, there's standing Uncle Sam and two soldiers, Russian and Japanese soldiers, from the right and from the left of him. They are wounded, they are bleeding, they are very irritated with each other. And Uncle Sam, with a semi-Hollywood, semi-demonic smile on his face, is holding American flag, and there are two words on this flag, international law. It seems to me like a symbol of Russian attitude to this problem, to the American participation in this situation. And now my questions to Professor Lukoyanov. In your paper you wrote that despite their, revolution and war in Russia, despite their chronological proximity, it cannot be asserted that these events were interconnected. Of course, I agree with you that in Soviet and Russian historiography, they often exaggerated the connection between these two events, but still we cannot say that it was simply a coincidence. So if not Russian revolutionary events, would the Portsmouth Treaty have the same design and timing? It's my first question. And my second question to you, of course you remember the words of Alexander Pushkin that there are two Russian sins, laziness and lack of curiosity. Don't you think that the experience of Russo-Japanese war made Russian elites be more curious? I mean, the position of Witte when he was amazed with the Japanese political culture, I mean, the design of constitution, Japanese constitution, and and he forced, when it was a problem of the design of Russian constitution of 1906, that some features of Japanese constitution should be used, should be present in the project of Russian constitution. What do you think about his position? Was it due to his amazement, or was it due to the reality, to the fact that it was a constitution of a winner? Thank you.
Thank you very much. A number of very important questions have been raised by the two commentators. I'd like to give the presenters about 5 minutes each to respond to some of these questions. Go ahead. Oh, go ahead.
Thank you. Connected with the first question, the connection between a revolution and the Russo-Japanese war and the peaceful conference in Portsmouth. I think that the revolution and Russo-Japanese war had the same cases. The main problem of Russian Empire in the turn of 19th and 20th century was that the Russian power rejected the idea of reform. When the Great Far Eastern policy, program of Great Far Eastern policy started in the second half of 90s, the autocracy had a selection between to start a reform as a continuance of reform Alexander the Great. For example, the new peasantry reform, or to start a wide-scale Far Eastern policy, economic aggressive policy in the Far East. And the result of discussion in the Russian government in that time was that Nicholas II decided to start a Far Eastern active policy. and he suggested that reforms had to wait to start. This is the main case of the first Russian Revolution and the Russo-Japanese War too. This is my reply for the first question. The second question, the rethinking of Russian oligarchy, the result of Russo-Japanese War, and the Witte's attitude to Japanese constitution. Witte's attitude to Japanese constitution was very simple. When the new edition of fundamental law was discussion in the start of 96th, Witte required some translation of constitutional acts of number of European countries, and one of his resolutions he asked, I would like to read Japanese constitution, let's translate it for me, because I would like to realize not European, but the experience all over the world. But I'm sorry, but I don't know any example that Witte use really the Japanese constitution and to take any articles of it for to use in Russian fundamental law new edition. I think Witte was very interesting, of course, because he know about Japanese experience, and he knows the result of Russo-Japanese War. Of course, he was. Yes, and he was very realistic political person and tried to use any experience, any political experience, and the Japanese experience seemed to be very successful in the modernization of empire, Japanese empire. It is the main case which Witte asked to translate Japanese constitution from Japanese to French, I think. But in general, the result of Russo-Japanese War and the rethinking of Russian policy, I think only foreign policy may reflect any result of rethinking. Foreign policy became more, I think, not so aggressive, not so wide-scale plans of intervention, so on, economical expansion. This plan was rejected. This is the main result of Russo-Japanese War and the lessons. But in the same case, I think the result of war, only war, was not so evident.
Let me respond to both sets of comments. First of all, I think what Professor Gordon said about the long-term view is really important. Obviously, I come at it from what is the long-term view of American relations, but I think he is dead right that the long-term relations between Japan and Korea were set, at least in part, at the Treaty of Portsmouth, and look at the condition of those relationships today and how much it is a reliving of history. Japanese-Chinese relations and Japanese-Russian relations. So I think the perspective of us all should be to stand back from the Treaty of Portsmouth and look at 100 years and try to figure out its role in 100 years. And I thank you for the comment, and I'll certainly do some more thinking about that myself. To Professor Filippova and her comment about did Roosevelt's view depart from the man or woman on the street? This has been a day, hasn't it, or 24 hours of images, the wonderful postcards last night and from the Library of Congress today. This book happens to have 4 cartoons in it as inserts, and this is a cartoon of a bear with a crown on it, obviously a Japanese man, and Theodore Roosevelt, and the title is President Roosevelt, the Peace Showman. And this is the quote: "Here, ladies and gentlemen, is the newest attraction. This bear, a ravenous beast of prey, subdued by Togo and Oyama, is now so tame that he subscribes to anything that is dictated to him." This is not Theodore Roosevelt's view. This is the view of the man on the street. Sometimes old stuff is good and stays up. In 1948, Winston Thorson did an article that I thought was very important in the American Historical Review on American public opinion and the Portsmouth Peace Conference. And he shows in that article in 1948, which has never been contradicted in any systematic way, contrary to Tyler Dennett, Howard K. Beale, and a whole bunch of other people, that American public opinion and American newspapers and journals remained favorable to Japan from the beginning of the war to the end of the Treaty of Portsmouth. Notwithstanding what Witte tried to do with the media, his romancing of the media, there was no progress whatsoever. It didn't move at all. And that, I think, is an important point. It is interesting to me, watching the postcards last night, clearly there was this feeling of the yellow peril in the United States, which came to an explosion a year later in San Francisco. And there was clear American concern about Japan. But the attitude towards Russia were so much more pronounced that given a choice between Russia and China, and in fact, there's a great quote, and I'm not going to be, it's in my paper, and it is to the effect that who would you rather live under, Russia or Japan? And Kennan says Japan. He would rather live under, in effect, a Japanese conquest than a Russian conquest. And I think that was the man on the street. I think the intensity over anti-Semitism, the feeling widespread in the United States, and just that Nicholas was almost a caricature in the United States. And it wasn't just Theodore Roosevelt, but George Kennan. He used to speak to 2,000 and 3,000 people when he went out on his almost Chautauqua-like lectures. He was a very charismatic, popular lecturer, and he really did control the public opinion. So I think this Thorson article says it never deviated. It was not just the president, but it was the man and the woman on the street who were intensely anti-Russian, and that's just an attitude that played in to obviously all that happened after 1917 and became even more exaggerated.
Thank you very much. It's interesting. Did you say that in one of the Russian cartoons, the United States was depicted with the U.S. flag with two words? Did you say international norm? Mm-hmm. International norm, isn't it? That's interesting because if that's the image of the United States, that the United States stood for international norm, I mean, that image would seem to have stuck throughout the 20th century, maybe not today, but up until recently, there was some kind of equation between what the United States stands for and what international society stands for, right? And if that's what it was at that time, it's quite interesting because I think we also have to think of what the United States was doing, for example, in Panama in 1904, and Cuba and so on. But despite what the US was in fact doing, which may have been against international norms, there is the image that the United States is a very internationally law-abiding country. Despite the fact that it was really the Russian Tsar who had convened the 1899 Hague Conference and so on. I think the Russians may have been quite active in that process. I think this is a time in the international history at the turn of the century that many countries are becoming very interested in international law. And the question is which countries are going to promulgate international laws, which countries are going to abide by them. Everybody tries to be law-abiding, I think. And I don't think the United States is any more law-abiding than other countries, but there is that image, which is very interesting. But in any event, I don't want to monopolize my position here. Why don't we ask for questions? We have until shortly after 3 o'clock, I think, right? But 30, 40 minutes. Yes, please.
Thank you. I'm Ron Edgeworth. I was the one who came up with the idea for this conference back in 2001, and it's really great to see the way the Dickey Center has made what I imagined could happen. And to have all these scholars here and to listen to these wonderful papers. Professor Irier just gave me a kind of entry into the comment and questions I want to ask of the panelists, not only from this afternoon session, but this morning. And I thought I might start by just giving a contemporary view as written in an article titled "The World Significance of the Treaty of Portsmouth" by Frederick D. Martens, a Russian legal scholar, jurist, who wrote this in 1906 when he was serving on the International Court in The Hague, but had advised the Russian government during the negotiations in Portsmouth. He said it was thought, speaking about the time of the conference, and with much reason, that Mr. Roosevelt had advised the two belligerent powers in order to bring about another triumph of the ideas of mediation and arbitration, which since the great International Peace Conference of 1899 had gained increasing influence without the world. Skipping through a kind of historical narrative he gives, he concludes this part of the essay saying, "It seems to me that these bonds of kinship between the two conferences are indissoluble. They are created in the very nature of things. The Conference of Peace at The Hague is the mother, that at Portsmouth is her legitimate daughter, faithful and grateful." And I read that because what strikes me so far about the papers is one thing, they're very fine. They're rooted in a kind of archival history that I learned as regards to international history from Warren Cohen when I was a graduate student at Michigan State University. And yet, in some ways, I find them troubling in the way that they remain locked within the framework of a particular narrative of 20th century international history, which is the narrative of the competition between states, particularly militarized states and empires. So that in hindsight, within that framework, what we see and what was foregrounded are the coming world wars, the coming Cold War, the triumph of the United States as the victor in the Cold War. Now, starting with the quote from D. Martens, and putting into that, one of the important things historians do, the context of the times, of the events we're looking at, we can cluster together a whole group of important events that when we consider the context of our own time, another important context, the context from which we ask questions about this past 100 years ago, a different kind of set of questions emerges that haven't really been directly addressed, but Professor Irier, not surprisingly because he asked these kinds of different histories in recent work of his, come up. What I mean to say here is that we should remember that the Hague Peace Conference was called by Nicholas, partly obviously out of the weakness of the Russian state and the fear of modern military technology that was emerging in Germany and other states at the time, but also became the rallying point for literally tens of thousands, perhaps 1 million peace activists around the world. And that they converged on that conference and they began to organize what has become I call it world peace culture, because it's not a single movement, but a complex intersection of non-governmental and intergovernmental organizations. That in this period, the Nobel Prize was created. The Carnegie Endowment for Peace was created. Roosevelt was president during this war, and during the war, there was a World's Fair in St. Louis. The Interparliamentary Union, which was a gathering and still exists of all the peace activists and parliaments around the world, met at the St. Louis World Fair. And they resolved to send a delegation to Washington to ask Roosevelt to issue an official governmental call for the Second Hague Conference, which Roosevelt did while this war was going on. I could go on with the list of events that struck contemporaries as profoundly important, that the world had reached a point where, and they used this language, and I think one of our disadvantages of our what we've learned about hindsight is that we tend to dismiss out of hand the word civilized as necessarily racist, flawed, and without much merit. But they thought in terms of what the civilized nations should do in the face of another context, and that is the development of this military technology that would turn war into slaughter. Now, last night we got a few photographs, but my understanding, and I'm still working on the piece I never did finish for this conference, is that the photographs of slaughter had an immense impact on public opinion. The one image that struck me in John Dower's presentation last night as suggesting this was the image of Theodore Roosevelt dragging the Tsar and the Emperor with piles of skulls behind them to the peace treaty. Right? In a sense, answering the question that these million peace activists around the world were asking, what are civilized people to do when war becomes slaughter? Now, in this period, the two basic paths that the world peace culture has taken emerged, and we see them in play in The Hague particularly, but also in the Portsmouth Peace Conference. One is to say that war is no longer legitimate. It is no longer a legitimate extension of political policy. The other is to say it is so terrible now that we must confine it within a body of international law and practice so that only the combatants are killed and hurt, and the civilians, the prisoners, the wounded will be taken care of because we are human beings that share a common humanity, a common belief in these civilized values. So it seems to me questions that haven't been raised yet have to do with the way this new technology, and let me add to that, the new technology, not just the weapon, but the technology of communication and representation, the new technology of photographs published in popular magazines all around the world of this war. Alan Hockley was telling me yesterday, the most terrible, horrifying photographs were published while the negotiations were going on, and in Harper's in this country. And he thinks it has something to do with trying to put pressure on the delegates themselves to bring the treaty into fruition. So my set of questions for the people who spoke this morning is, because this is, one way we think about this war, and this was one of the inspirations for the conference, was this is like a window into what's coming. World War I is killing by industrialized, civilized nations. Mechanical death, the machine gun, sort of the epitome of that, right? And that's what we have here. Did the images of slaughter that come back from this war have any impact on the decision makers in Russia or in Japan? Did the impact of those images and the numbers that you can throw off, Professor Tranny throws some of them off, 12,000 here, 16,000 here, 160,000 at Mukden, right? Do they have any impact? Or are we really talking about, in a sense, an episode that reflects the distance we have to travel, perhaps into the early 21st century, our own century now, between those who live within that frame of international relations conceived of the competition between militarized empires, and those who see, and I think this may be, the history will tell in the future of the 20th century. The 20th century is the time when a new international order begins to emerge. And even though there are these events that seem, when you look back at it from 1918 as failures, or 1944 as failures, they are not. They are the foundation stones of a new world political culture that says we can no longer allow war to be legitimate. So my question then for the second group is, did any of that feed into the thinking of those who were actually negotiating the treaty?
Can I
It's
answer
a
that?
very specific question, and I think I'm going to collect some questions and then go back to the paper presenters in a few minutes to respond to those questions. But I think this is a very interesting question of contextualization, isn't it, or framework. In which framework are we going to study the Russo-Japanese War? We can do that in the framework of military history, diplomatic history, what some of us have begun to call transnational history. There's so many different ways of doing that. And I think you raise a very interesting question of why just choose the Russo-Japanese War as the most significant event of the first years of the 20th century, 1904, 1905, and so on. I would just remind them of the fact that we have the president of the Japan Society of Boston here. Peter Greeley might argue that because the Japan Society of Boston was founded in 1904, that was perhaps more important than the fact that the Russo-Japanese War broke out. And so we just have to choose, I think, pick and choose, and depending on what we choose. For example, some people might choose, as I was saying, the Panama Canal as having been the most important development in U.S. history and so on, or some people might say the convening of the Louisiana expedition was clearly very important. Depending on in what framework are we going to put these events in, and how they understand the subsequent developments of the various themes, I think we have a different perspective. And I think the conference organizers here have, at least for today's sessions, focused on those more formal diplomatic military affairs. But even so, I think your question about those images, the bloody images, the war casualties and so on, the impact of those images on domestic opinion, on the leadership, I think are a very legitimate part of the inquiry. And I hope the presenters can come back to that. But before I get to them, I'd like to collect a few more questions, if I may. Ed?
I have a question for Professor Tranny. You've argued that the Portsmouth Treaty is sort of the watershed of this century of hostility in U.S.-Russian relations, and given what happened subsequently, it's hard to argue with that general proposition. However, it seems to me that there's more than one way that one can be hostile towards a foreign country. And one way is, as you alluded to in your remarks, is sort of the yellow peril model, where the country is an enemy, and to some extent the hostility is sort of inherent. The enemy country is backwards, and it's always going to be that way. And so the categories of civilized and barbaric are more or less fixed. However, it seems to me that as you've described him, the arguments of George Kennan, and I would say not only George Kennan the Elder, but also the later George Kennan, don't really fit into that. They're not, it seems to me, portraying Russia as sort of the Slavic peril. Rather, their hostility towards Russia is something that it seems to me is more specific, and they're focusing specifically on this legacy of Russian government and autocracy and the Siberian exile system and so forth. And it seems to me that this is an important distinction to draw between these two types of hostility, because in the latter type, it's possible for the enemy country to become civilized. And some of the evidence that you present in your paper seems to support this way of reading Kennan. Specifically, his prediction that there's going to be a revolution in Russia holds out the possibility that Russia won't always be an enemy that's worthy of directing this hostility. And my question is, first of all, what do you think of this distinction between these two types of hostilities? And can this distinction I'm drawing between two types of hostilities be usefully applied to the subsequent century of U.S.-Russian relations? And then secondly, if you think this is a legitimate distinction, can it be applied to Portsmouth in particular, and specifically, where would you put Roosevelt? Is Roosevelt following Kennan in that he is anticipating and hoping for a revolution in Russia, or is his hostility towards Russia of the more permanent, more fixed Slavic peril type?
Yes, please.
Thank you very much. I think my question is related to the points discussed this afternoon. My question is, how should we understand American imperialism. As John Dower mentioned, this was an age of imperialism. And I think the United States then was an imperialist power. Well, in which kind of nature was it an imperialist power? Well, first we know that Philippines was an American colony. And second, we know that based on Katsura-Taft Treaty, United States want to preserve Philippines within its influence, and sort of in exchange agreed to let Japan take care of Korea. But now the third aspect about which I wanted to ask the wisdom of the room is there is this open door policy towards China, which I think was somewhat different from the views of other imperialist power. And certainly it was different from the way Japan or Russia took its position vis-à-vis Manchuria. Now, what was the nature of the American imperialism different from other countries' imperialism? And if so, then how different? And was this difference, but I think this difference became the basis of the future rivalry between the powers, which finally led to the war. Thank you.
In Japan and also in the United States, let me talk about one of the aspects which hasn't been so well aware of that. And if you have your opinions on what I'm going to say, I'm willing to listen to you. This Portsmouth Peace Conference started on August the 10th officially, and up until August the 18th, the two issues, in other words, the indemnity issue and the territory issue, they went to the deadlock. And on the 19th, Roosevelt called the delegates to his house to try to ask Roman Rosen of Russia to make more compromise. And then Kaneko Okentaro went to Sakama Hill on the 21st, where Roosevelt residence was. And as a result of the Kaneko-Roosevelt meeting on the 21st, Roosevelt said he would send a confidential telegraph to Russia to make more compromise. So he sent a telegraph to Ambassador Meyer, urging him to see Nikolai II as soon as possible to make more concessions. It was on the 23rd where Ambassador Meyer was able to see him. At the end, Nicholas II said that if it was only 30 years ago when the Sakhalin became Russian territory, so they could make a compromise for a southern half of Sakhalin. So that was a small fruit through this effort. And the telegraph was sent to Roosevelt immediately. Then on the 25th, in order to find out what happened, Kaneko came to Roosevelt again, giving up southern half of Sakhalin, which was a very important issue for Japan, wasn't communicated to Kaneko from Roosevelt at all. And even up to now, nobody knows why Roosevelt didn't mention that. Professor Trainee, not your new book, but I read your old book, and so unless I'm mistaken about my reading, on the day Kaneko visited Roosevelt, he was very busy in the morning because Pranziam or some such a submarine, the first one, came to the area near the Oyster Bay, and President Roosevelt paid attention or was more curious about that submarine, showing pleasure. And 2 hours was spent by submarine in the Connecticut area, and Roosevelt paid too much attention to that, and so at 11 o'clock, Kaneko came, but maybe because of his interest in the submarine, he forgot to mention that the possibility of returning southern half of Sakhalin. But at any rate, he didn't communicate that to Kaneko. Then how did Japan find it out? On the 28th in Tokyo, there was a man, Ishiji Kikujiro. He was a government official, and he was called by Claude MacDonald, the U.S. minister, to Tokyo. And Mr. Ishii wasn't so happy about being called again, but 30 minutes later, he was very surprised to come back to the government office, telling that the one half of the Sakhalin will be returned. So it became a big issue in the foreign ministry. Then why did the MacDonald tell this to Ishii? If it was an official communication, then MacDonald should have told this to a higher-ranking official of the ministry. But in the Boxers' Rebellion, Mr. Ishii seems to be the first secretary in the legation. And at the time of Boxers' Rebellion, Mr. MacDonald and Mr. Ishii were surrounded by them, and so they couldn't get out of the building for 55 days. So they became friends with each other. So that's why Mr. MacDonald wanted to tell this to Kaneko. And the official communication came from Harding. But he didn't show the official telegraph from Britain, and he read it out twice to Kaneko and asking him to memorize that. So without showing the document, Mr. Ishii memorized that, rushed back to the foreign ministry. And he sent the new instruction to Portsmouth delegation. That's how Japanese delegation came to learn this.
So Komura was a bit in the clouds, but a new directive was sent to him, and based on that, on the 29th of August, a compromise was made. So the negotiations did not break down, and the rest is history. Now, what I question in this is the following. Most likely, the Japanese government at that time, I would believe, started to distrust President Roosevelt. Certainly, after the war in 1906, President Roosevelt was awarded the Nobel Peace Prize. I think that was a great thing. That said, the Japanese government never invited President Roosevelt to come as a state, call for any state visit by President Roosevelt. Kaneko mentioned, as there was a statement made that they wanted to welcome the president, yet the official invitation never came. To thank Roosevelt for all the work he had done, we should have presented him with a medal, and none of that took place. So the question here is why? Why was Roosevelt not being recognized?
これは金融的に非常に日本の経済力を助けてくれたわけですけれども、このヤコブシフは1906年戦争終わった翌年の3月から4月にかけましてね、東京ではもう桜が満開なんですね。大川乱漫という中をですね、ヤコブシフは奥さんどころか、
was invited,
同等も引き連れてですね、
along with his wife and his
東京へ
family,
やってきます。
was
これは
invited to
日本
Japan
の
in the spring
日本
of
銀行総裁の招待
1906.
でやってくるわけですね。
He was
そして
invited by
滞在
the
中、
governor
なんと1
of
ヶ月以
the
上日本
Bank
に
of
いるわけです
Japan,
が、
and he stayed
もう箱根
there
行った
for
り、日光
over
行ったりです
a
ね、あ
month.
ら
He
ゆる
went
と
to
ころを見
was
て、
taken to Hakone, he was
韓
taken to
国ソウルま
Nikko,
で行っており
and
ます。
he even went as far as
その時
Seoul
にですね。
at that
そし
time
て、
at
その
the
滞在中
invitation
に明
of
治天皇
the
に拝
Bank
謁
of
しまして
Japan.
ね、
He
そして
went
勲
to
章
see
をです
the
ね、勲二と
Meiji Emperor,
特日重功章とい
and
う
he was
素
given
晴らしい勲章まで
an
もらっていらっ
extremely
しゃるわけです。
honorable
にも
medal.
かかわらず、ルーズベルトがな
In
ぜ
spite of that,
そういうような
why was
いわゆ
Roosevelt
る国
never
賓としての
been
日本訪
treated
問、
as
それから
a
叙
state
勲
guest?
全然なかったんだろうか、なぜだと
Why
いう
is
こ
it
と
that
が
there was
私はもう
no
かねてからのこう疑問であ
recognition?
りましてね。
This has always been
で、その辺
a question that I've
どな
had
た
in
か
my mind. If
いや
anybody
こうなんだろうと
can
いうふうに
explain this to me,
お考えい
if
ただ
you
けるよ
have
うでしたら
any
ぜ
idea,
ひ教えていただきたいと
I would be very
思うことと、
obliged.
つまりそのこれは私自身の勝手
Also,
な考えというか解
This,
釈なんです
I'm
が、
merely
そういうその
speculating,
日本政
but
府が何かこうルーズベルトに対して不
the
信感を抱い
Japanese
てしまったという
government
ことの反面としてですね、
becoming
その
somewhat
日
distrustful
本
of
の政治の
Roosevelt
見方がですね、どうも日露戦争には
perhaps
日本が独力
has
で
to
勝ったと、
do with
アメリカの全
the
然援助
feeling
なしに
that
ですね、独力で勝てたと
the
いう
U.S.
ふう
never
に
gave help
だん
to
だんこう
Japan
思い込んでいきましてね。
during the
で結局
Russo-Japanese
それ
war.
が
That was this
日本というような
idea
形
that
でぐるぐ
people
るぐる
started
ぐ
to
る進んでいって
embrace.
しまった。でそれがまあ
And
結局は
So that
パールハーバーまで行って
perhaps
しまうという
resulted
ような
in
ことになっていったんじゃないか
a
と
series of events
いうの
that
が、まあ
ultimately
私の
led to
まあ
Pearl Harbor, perhaps.
もうよろしいですか。ちょっと時間
はい
なるから。
はいいうことで、そ
So
の辺のもし、何か
if anyone
これ
could
だとおっしゃるような
見せしますよ。Go ahead.
offer me some insights on this, please.
Right. Can I just make a comment whenever we come to that stage to the first gentleman's comment to the first session of today? Your question about the images of slaughter and how it affected the domestic audience in Japan. So I'll wait until the panel responds, and I'd like to chip in to that particular discussion.
Do we have any further comment? Yes, go ahead. Yoki-san.
すべての戦争には予想外の展開というのがございます。
All wars have some unexpected developments.
それをどう吸収するかというのが
How
講和の
to
問題であ
observe
り、
them
また
is the issue of
国々のパーセプションの
peacemaking
問題だと思います。
and each country's
日
perception
本側のパーセプ
issues.
ションはどうであったか。
What was Japanese perception?
日本側が日本の新聞が掲げていた戦争目
Japanese
的というのは
press talked about the goals of the war, as the eternal peace for East Asia.
当初はそれだけではなかったですが、
Initially, there were some other goals.
韓国を日本やロシアが取り合うということではなくて、戦線
Instead
の上に上がっていくに従って、
of controlling
そういう
over
抽象的な理念という
Korea
のが
between
新聞の
Japan
社説
and
の表面を
Russia,
飾るようになった
and the editorial of
それを前提
newspapers
にして
talked
ポーツマス講和
about
というものを
some
考えます
more
と、ほ
abstract
とんどの新聞が批判しますけども、
goals.
実は議論のレベルではですね、
Think of
講和
Portsmouth
は
peace.
そう悪い講和
Most
では
of
ないということになって
newspapers criticized, but in the
賠
end,
償金が取れなか
they
った
were
のは
not so
残念。
bad. It was a pity
しか
not
し
to be able to
日
win
本が賠償金を取ること
indemnity.
が
But
東アジア永遠の平和とどういう
if
関係があ
Japan
るか。
had
東アジア永遠の平和にこだわるのであれば、一番批
it's
判を浴びたの
then
は
what is
南カ
that
ラフトしか取れ
related
なか
to
った
eternal peace
北カ
for
ラフトを
East
取れなか
Asia?
ったことです。なぜなら日本とロシアが陸続きになって、その平和が損なわれ
Another
る
thing is that Japan
し
got
かし、その議論
only
を
the
すれ
southern
ば、南
half
カラ
of
フトも取らずに、カラフトを全部諦め
then
ればよかったということになってしまう。
how
現にそういうふうに
would
口を
that
滑
be
らせて
related
いるの
to
は
a
ですから、
permanent
純粋な議
peace?
論のレベルでは、
And
講
so
和
at the
はさほど悪い講和ではなかった。
discussion level, the peace content wasn't so bad.
講和に反対
In
し
the
て起
end,
きた日比谷の暴動という
heavier
のは
riots
政府のリーダー
in
にとって
opposition
も
to
意外で
the
したが、
peace content
反
or
政府の側のリー
unexpected
ダーと
to
しても
the
非常に意外で、
Japanese
また
government,
狼狽を招く
government, but also was unexpected to anti-government people as well. Hibiya riots pointed out Japanese constitution problems. It was ambivalent, and it had some positive effects of encouraging the popular participation in politics, but there was some damage on the party politics. Hibiya incident caused a serious problem to the very cool-headed debate among the political parties. So Hibiya incident showed that the people and the government were not appropriately ready for the post-war period. And Japan sustained a serious damage. I have a question to Professor Trainee. In Japan, Japan had a fairly good advantageous position in Manchuria, and what did that give any effect on the Japanese perception?
Shall we have just one final question, and then we're going to return to the speakers.
My name is Liz Charlo from Harvard. Thank you very much. I'll be very brief. I have one question for each of the two speakers, and I was interested that both of them were challenging conventional wisdom. For Professor Trainee, I thought it was really interesting that, and an effective case that you made to show that President Roosevelt's perceptions of Japan did not change throughout the treaty negotiations. But the question I would ask you is, did that matter? Did that really have any effect on the treaty itself? Especially since we all understand that the effectiveness of Roosevelt was bringing the parties together and not actually the terms of the treaty. And to Professor Lukianov, it was fascinating comment about Vita, that he saw his role here as perhaps a springboard to get back into politics. And I'm curious to know what sources are out there that would explain that, especially in light of the probably well-known quote that he once made, that it was interesting that he was always only called upon to clean up the dirty work. Thank you.
I think time has come for us to go back to the speakers and have their responses to the question.
Thank you. First question connected with the articles of Martens. First of all, before Martens, about 30 years before Martens, in Russia was published a large book, multi-volume book of Blioch, connected with the problem of modern war of the second half of 19th century. This book reflected the problem of the war as a tragedy, as a catastrophe for nation, for powers. And I think that the result of this tension was the understanding that the war can't decide any problem. War may create the wide-scale problem, and problems very dangerous for every power. I think that is the political lessons of the last wars of the end of 19th and the beginning of 20th century. It was the main case of Hugh Conference first and second, and the understanding the peace was better than every war. But I think that image of war victims and so on had not directly had not directly influence to the political decision. Of course, the image of the war was a real impact to public opinion. And the country where the public opinion was very, very important, very, very influential to the power, it was the result of the power activity, how to stop every war. But for the autocracy, for example, Russia and so on, it is not the case, for example, to start or to finish the war. The main result of this and the same war was that the perception of authority, perception of power became that every war is very dangerous for power. Every war may be connected with revolution. It was the main result. It was a conclusion of this process. I think it's the main tendency of 20th century. The second, about American imperialism. I think American imperialism at the beginning of 20th century has some specific features. First of all, America became the first economical power, first economical country in the world. It is the basic understanding of features specific of American imperialism. And the policy of open door is a reflection of this economical situation. The third, details of Portsmouth peaceful conference. So I have not enough time to repeat some details, but your impression of peaceful conference is not quite correct, because events that you talk about was not so. First of all, you try to explain that the result of peaceful conference was connected with negotiation between Roosevelt and Kaneka. I think that is not right, because of Roosevelt demands from Nicholas II not the ceding of territory. Roosevelt demand to pay indemnity, first of all, and Nicholas II categorically rejected this idea, and Russia had not paid any indemnity as a result. So impressions of Roosevelt was not any power to the position of Nicholas II. And if you know, Roosevelt was supported by the German Emperor Wilhelm II and French president that Russia must pay indemnity, but it had not any result too. So I think the main result of Portsmouth Conference and contradiction between Roosevelt and Japanese delegation based on the principle that Roosevelt reflected the idea of American interest, American diplomacy. The main idea of Roosevelt was that it would be better if two weak enemies conclude a peace, which keeps the situation of two enemies in the Far East. It was the main idea of Roosevelt, but it was not the main idea for Japanese diplomacy. So I think Roosevelt, of course, was not enemy of Japan, but interests of Japan and the US was very, very contradictory between each other. And the last question about Witte. Also is connected with the attitude, with the position connected to his ideas and his participants in the possible peaceful conference. First of all, of course, it is not his memories. It is most of all his correspondence and correspondence connected with him. Partly, part of this correspondence was published, part had never published before. But the situation of Witte's position as a whole may confirm that Witte interest based on his own political strategy, how to return to power. It's possible very easy to explain his decisions. So that's all. Thank you.
I'm going to try to respond to 4 of the comments. First, the very important comment about is American attitudes the result of some sort of Slavic peril versus unhappiness with the government. I don't know which it is, but it's striking that we never got happy with the Tsarist government. We were never happy with the communist government. Now we're not happy with Putin's government. There's a pattern there. And no matter what the Russians do, it's never enough for us. Hold elections, establish a Duma, do this, do that, they do it, and it's not quite the way Americans want it, and it's almost like a bar that is raised higher and higher and higher. And my impression now, and there are obviously Russians here who can speak, that they don't much care what Americans think now. At one point, I think they did, and what I worry about is, I don't know, a resurgence of the Cold War or a resurgence of American-Russian hostility. We've lost a great opportunity since 1991, and that concerns me enormously. So I don't know whether it's Slavic peril or unhappiness with the government, but we've never seen a government in Russia in 100 years that we've been happy with. And it's culturally, it's a real sense of imperialism, of expecting them to have a government like ours. So that is what I would respond there. To the comments about The Hague and did people really take this all seriously, bodies, and go read Theodore Roosevelt's Nobel lecture of November 5th, 1910. Okay. He said three things. He said, first of all, typical Rooseveltian, I speak as a practical man, and whatever I now advocate, I have tried to do when I was, for the time being, the head of a great nation and keenly jealous of its honor and interest. I ask other nations to do only what I should be glad to see my own nation do. Three things. First, there can be treaties of arbitration. Long paragraph on treaties of arbitration. Second, there is the further development of the Hague Tribunal, of the work of the conferences and courts at The Hague. And third, rather extraordinary, it would be a masterstroke if those powers honestly bent on peace would form a League of Peace, not only to keep peace among themselves, but to prevent by force, if necessary, its being broken by others. So I think this war did have an impact on Roosevelt. Now, to the question of his view of Japan, it didn't change, but did it matter, yes or no? I think it did matter in the sense that, and I'm keenly aware what Igor said and what others have said, that in the end it was the Russian and the Japanese who decided upon peace. But I think what Roosevelt did was he, by consistently being pro-Japanese and portraying that image to the American people, kept what happened in 1906 out of 1904 and 5. There could have been a natural inclination of the yellow peril sense, and that wasn't really part of Roosevelt's thinking. He was really concerned about the preservation of China, which gets to the point that you asked about Manchuria. That was important to him, and if the Japanese did not accept the preservation of China, that would have been something that Roosevelt really had problems with. But I think his views did matter because I think they tempered American public opinion, which I think became intensely anti-Japanese in the period 1906 through 1908. So he's an extraordinary guy, there is no question about it. For him to say those things in his Nobel Peace address in 1910, we have this impression of this activist, combative person. He was very reflective in an awful lot of ways, and the further I get away from him and comparing him with Wilson and with other people I've worked on, the more admiration I do have for Theodore Roosevelt. So those would be my comments.
Thank you very much. The two of you like to add anything at this point? No? Thank you very much. I think we bring this session to conclusion, and Steve would like to make some.
Sorry, if I can just. I think there was a bit of Professor Edwards wanted to ask a question about the impact of the Russo-Japanese War, and if I can just very quickly talk about that for just 1 second. The answer is read Jack Snyder's book, The Ideology of the Offensive, written by a political scientist, but nevertheless a good book. And in it, he points out that people drew exactly the wrong lessons from the Russo-Japanese War. It's not that war is costly, but you have to be infused with national spirit, with the offensive, and with l'audace.
Sorry. Yeah, go ahead.
Yes, thanks very much. In response to your question, obviously images of slaughter were important, but you got to remember that there was quite a strong censorship at the time in Japan anyway. And in the end, images of death didn't really matter anymore because you started actually seeing real dead people coming back from the field. And this is when the Japanese, in the domestic Japanese society, the sense of not wanting to fight the war. It's not actually anti-war in the political sense, but it's actually, in Japanese, it's called ensen kibun. It's essentially not wanting to kind of participate in fighting just for the sake of fighting, the war. And that sort of sentiment really begins to pervade in the society, and that is because of the 74,000 war dead, which starts streaming back into Japan, particularly from about August 1904. So from that time onwards, you just see tons of funerals, commemoration ceremonies being held throughout every single village in Japan. And images of the death were, in some sense, no longer relevant because you actually had real death at home. Thank you.
Okay.
Yeah, I'll be very brief. For about 2 minutes of remarks. Number one is the fact that a lot of these pieces, the academic side of what we're talking about today, these pieces fit together in the sense that much of what we're doing today is a continuation of that which we did, and of course many scholars before us did, but that which we did in the Russo-Japanese War in Global Perspective, World War Zero. So, for example, I'll be unabashedly commercial about it. There were a number of works in there that the editorial board thought were head-turning. One is Professor Shimatsu's treatment of the way in which the war is depicted and seen by the Japanese themselves, with reference to a question that was posed to Professor Lukianoff. Another issue, John Bushnell just wrote a capital piece on the influence of the war on the revolution in Russia. And there are many other pieces like that. One thing that strikes me, and again the continuation, if you look at linkages or look at conflict and warfare as embedded in politics, if you look at what is very much on Witta's mind during the Portsmouth conference, is the fact that despite what had happened to the Russian Pacific, the 2nd and 3rd Russian Pacific squadrons at Tsushima, the Russians still had an army group in central Manchuria, and that was an army group with which the Japanese could not deal. And essentially that becomes, to use the colloquial expression American, it becomes an ace in the hole for Witta during negotiations, because he knows that, in fact, before he left St. Petersburg for the United States, one of his last visits was to War Minister Rediger, in which he sat down and said, "Oh, tell me about that army group. Tell me how an English word, combat worthy it is, and despite the fact that it can't undertake offensive operations, can it continue to persist there?" So all of these parts fit together. The part about Roosevelt and what he's looking at, and yes, we can talk about many different kinds of imperialism, but if you're looking at something that we might call imperialism soft, in which you're talking not about territorial acquisition, but you're looking at access to markets and resources. Support of the open door and a balance of power between Japan and Russia in the Far East makes every bit of sense from the American perspective. Well.
Thank you very much. One final, really final.
I want to respond to what Ron said and what we've been talking about in terms of mass slaughter. And I'm going to try to broaden this out, as I seem to be doing today for no premeditated reason. But what happened? And by that I mean Theodore Roosevelt in his Nobel Prize speech can say, we need to form a League of Nations who want peace. Okay? But 1914 to 1918 happens. And if you look at that, and you look at if there is a body of literature called World War I studies today, what they talk about is how this mass slaughter became acceptable in the minds of people in society. People volunteered to fight wars, and in the minds of governmental leaders. Now, we do have what Professor Lukianoff had to say as well. There is this thing where governments fall when people become really agitated with the conduct of their governments. Okay, but still, Still, after World War I, well, I don't want to get too absurd here, but you go through the 20s and 30s, you can focus on Stalinism, more mass slaughter. You can go into World War II and more mass slaughter. And I tend to look at this as the fundamental problem here is the problem of war termination. And I think that's what we're talking about here today, and that's where I'll stop. I think we all need to think about this as we enjoy our meal this evening and come back tomorrow. Thank you.
Thank you very much. I think we'll bring this to an end finally. Steve, would you like to make some kind of announcement?
Yeah, just a couple of announcements. If you see on your schedule, there's an optional guided tour, or probably several tours of the Baker Library Bell Tower, and I think the last leg of that involves climbing a ladder, is that right? I believe. But it's a spectacular view of the upper valley from up there, and if you're interested in that, just meet at the information desk at 4 o'clock, just out here in the corridor. And then dinner will be at the Dartmouth Outing Club House, which is the other end of Ockham Pond. It's about a 10 or 15-minute walk. But there will be shuttle service from the Hanover Inn, in front of Hanover Inn, to the Dartmouth Outing Club, starting at 6 o'clock and then going till 9:30 until after the dinner. Cocktails start at 6:30 and dinner is at 7 at the Dartmouth Outing Club. So thank you very much to the panel this afternoon and this morning too. Thank you.